Timothy disappeared without a trace, old Mr. Johnson said, his voice rough like gravel. His truck was still parked out front, and not a single thing in the house was out of place. His words hung in the air, heavy, like an old memory you can't quite shake. Me and my wife, Emma, had just moved into a new home in this quiet little town, far away in a state neither of us had ever stepped foot in before. We'd had enough of the judgment from our overly religious families, who just couldn't stand the idea of us living together without being married. Things got so bad that they shared our phone number and address with their church folks. It didn't take long before we were drowning in phone calls and letters, day and night. It was unbearable. So we pooled every penny we could scrape together and stumbled on what felt like a miracle, a house at a price too good to pass up. The young couple selling it had been oddly eager to wrap things up, but we didn't ask too many questions. We were desperate for a fresh start, and this house felt like salvation. Fast forward a week, and we were sitting down for dinner at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, an older couple who'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone. They'd invited us over as a kind welcome gesture. And honestly, it was nice to feel a little grounded in this strange, new place. "He used to own your place, you know, before the young couple sold it to you," Mr. Johnson said, swirling his wine glass like he had all the time in the world. "The bank got it after he vanished. Those kids bought it for a song. But they didn't stay long. Moved out after just a year. Me? I don't ask questions. Folks do what they do." He took a slow sip of wine, his eyes flicking to Mrs. Johnson for just a moment. Under the table, Emma grabbed my hand and squeezed, her fingers tense. "Did anyone ever find out what happened to him?" she asked, her voice careful, like she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Mr. Johnson shook his head, slow and deliberate. "Nope, not a word." It was like the earth just swallowed him whole. The room got a little quieter after that. Mrs. Johnson, clearly picking up on the unease, leaned forward with a warm smile. Her voice was soft, almost motherly. "Oh, don't you let Timothy's story worry you," she said. "He was always a bit of an odd duck, kept to himself. My guess? He probably just up and started over somewhere new. This is a peaceful, quiet town. Nothing strange ever happens here." Their words stuck with us long after we thanked them and walked back home that night. It felt good knowing someone in the neighborhood, but the story stayed in my mind. As the days turned into weeks, Emma and I settled in, falling more in love with the quirks of the house and the freedom it gave us. It was the fresh start we'd been dreaming about for so long. 3 months slipped by and life felt easy, peaceful even. But one night, everything took a turn. We were getting ready for dinner at this cozy little restaurant we'd taken to calling our spot. I was rummaging through the bedroom closet, trying to find a decent shirt, when I saw it. A small, weathered door, painted pale blue, barely 4 feet tall, was tucked behind the row of hanging jackets like it had always been there. The paint was cracked and peeling, showing darker layers underneath, and the wood looked like it had seen better days. My hands froze mid-motion, and for a second, it felt like the whole world had stopped. "Emma!" I hollered, louder than I'd meant to. "Come here. Quick!" She came running in, wrapping her arms around my waist in her usual playful way. "What's up?" she asked, but her voice faded the moment she spotted the door. "What in the world?" she whispered, stepping closer. We both just stood there, staring. We'd lived in this house for months. I'd used this closet every single day. There was no way we could have missed it. "It's probably for storage or something," I said, though my voice wavered like I didn't believe it myself. "Maybe for the heater?" Emma crossed her arms, her face tight with worry. "Jack, no. That door wasn't there. We would have noticed it when we moved in. I'm telling you, it wasn't there before." I reached out, fingers hesitating for just a moment, and then pulled the door open. It swung easily without even a creak. Behind it was a small, dim room no bigger than a kid's bedroom. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, its faint light barely cutting through the shadows. The walls were plain, gray, and bare. Nothing but emptiness. "Looks like extra storage, I guess," I muttered, even though my gut told me something didn't add up. Emma shrugged. but I could tell by the tight set of her shoulders that she wasn't buying it. "I don't like this, Jack," she said quietly. "How could we have missed something like this?" We didn't have an answer, so we let it go. Over the next few days, the door just became another strange part of the house, something we tried not to think about. But then, a week later, everything changed. Again, Maggie was at work, and I was home alone, trying to straighten up the bedroom. I grabbed a shirt to hang in the closet, but the moment my hand reached inside, I froze. The door was gone. Where it once had been, there was now just a smooth, beige wall, as if the door had never existed at all. My heart pounded in my chest as I shoved the clothes aside, running my fingers over the surface. Where the hell did it go? I muttered under my breath, knocking on the wall like I could force it to reappear. The empty wall felt far more unsettling than the door ever had. By the time Maggie got home, I'd given up on figuring it out and turned to the only thing that made sense at the moment. Beer. I was sitting at the kitchen table halfway through my third can when she walked in. "Tough day?" she joked, dropping her bag on the counter with a grin. "You have no idea," I replied, shaking my head. "You're not going to believe this. I've just got to show you." I stood up and led her toward the bedroom, my stomach tight with nervous energy. Maggie followed, her expression softening into curiosity. But before we even reached the bedroom, we both stopped dead in our tracks. There it was, the pale blue door, standing right in the middle of the hallway where it absolutely should not have been. Its cracked wood and peeling paint looked as if it had been there forever, daring us to question it. We turned to each other, wide-eyed, sharing a moment of silent disbelief. Without saying a word, I reached for the doorknob and pulled it open. This time, the door revealed something completely different. It wasn't the small, empty room we'd seen before. Instead, we found ourselves staring at what looked like a tiny study. In the center of the room sat an old wooden desk, its surface scarred and worn by years of use. On top of it, a single candle flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Above us, a narrow staircase spiraled upward, flanked by bookshelves crammed with dusty, weathered volumes. "Holy," Maggie started to say. "Shit," I finished for her. Neither of us moved at first. We just stood there, staring at the room, equal parts mesmerized and unnerved. There was something hauntingly beautiful about it. The way the candlelight danced across the walls, the quiet stillness of the space, the strange allure of those crowded bookshelves. Felt like stepping into another world. We couldn't resist. Both of us had always been avid readers, and whatever fear or hesitation we'd felt melted away as our love for books took over. We stepped inside, drawn to the shelves like moths to a flame. My fingers brushed over the spines, the rough texture of the books grounding me in the moment. But something was off. The titles were familiar, yet somehow wrong. I pulled out a copy of The Return of the King, one of my all-time favorites, and flipped to the ending, expecting to relive the triumph of Frodo and the destruction of the One Ring. Instead, I found something entirely different. In this version, Sauron reclaimed the ring, plunging Middle-earth into endless darkness. My stomach turned as I read. "Maggie?" I called, my voice low and uneasy. "These endings, they're not right." She glanced up from a battered copy of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, her brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" she asked, flipping through the pages. But as she read, her expression shifted. "No way," she whispered, shaking her head. In her version, Alice never escaped Wonderland. Instead, she was trapped there, the whimsical world turning cruel and nightmarish as she realized she was caught in a never-ending cycle of madness. It didn't stop there. Every book we pulled from the shelves told a similar story. Familiar tales twisted into something dark and despairing. To Kill a Mockingbird ended with the town succumbing to hatred, Atticus shunned, and Scout left completely alone. Every page we turned felt like stepping deeper into some warped mirror version of reality. The books looked real, the covers, the pages, the words themselves. They felt like authentic works by the authors, but the stories inside were wrong. Desperate for answers, we took a handful of the books to a local bookstore, hoping the owner might be able to shed some light. She humored us, but clearly thought we were playing some elaborate joke. This was the late 80s, after all. There was no internet to dig up answers, no easy way to figure out what was going on. As the days turned into weeks, the pale blue door became an unsettling fixture of our lives. We'd go back to the study often, poring over the bizarre books late into the night, our conversations looping endlessly around the mysteries of the house. Somehow, the strangeness of it all became normal, at least until the house decided to show us something new. While I was digging through the shelves in the study one evening, I stumbled across a hidden panel tucked behind the desk. My pulse quickened as I pried it open, revealing an old, brittle book with no title or author. Its leather cover was cracked, faded, and damp to the touch, giving off the musty scent of mildew and time. When I flipped it open, the pages revealed a collection of dark, unsettling fairy tales I'd never seen before. One story in particular gripped me. Its words seemed to hum in my mind like a faint, eerie tune I couldn't shake. That night, as we lay in bed, I read it aloud to Maggie. In a place where reality's edges softly dissolve, a hidden sanctuary cloaked in twilight exists. Here, the waters, clear as polished glass, reflect not the sky but a void alive with whispering stars. Shadows and light entwine in an intricate dance, revealing and concealing truths in equal measure. Within this realm, an energy unseen pulses, shifting the balance between serenity and a silent prison. Above, the grand observatory once pierced the cosmic veil, aligning mortal fates with the intricate waltz of stars and shadowed voids. Below, mirrors do more than reflect. They entrap the essence of those who dare to peer into their depths, holding echoes of wandering souls suspended in time and space. This sanctuary breathes with the quiet sighs of ancient walls, its very presence omniscient, watching unblinking from the void. Hidden within its forgotten spaces, a ravenous force stirs, feasting on the buried fears and forbidden desires of those ensnared by its ancient lure. When I finished reading, Maggie stared at me, her eyes wide. She was silent for a moment before whispering, "What do you think it means?" "I have no idea," I replied, shaking my head. "I don't know what any of this means. Do you think we should tell someone about it?" She hesitated, then said, "What about the Whitakers? Maybe they'd believe us, or at least see it for themselves." It wasn't a bad idea. That weekend, we invited Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker over for dinner. After we'd polished off dessert, I casually suggested a tour of the house. Maggie and I exchanged nervous glances as we led them to the hallway where the pale blue door should have been. But as we turned the corner, our hearts sank. The door was gone. All that greeted us was the same plain, beige wall as before, ordinary, lifeless, and impossibly infuriating. Maggie and I scrambled to keep our expressions neutral, forcing smiles as the Whitakers praised our home. We made small talk and said our goodbyes, but once they were gone, we were left staring at each other, stunned. "The house?" Maggie whispered, her voice shaking. "It's toying with us." We stayed up late that night, going back and forth about what to do. Were we losing our minds? Was the house truly supernatural? Should we pack up and leave? But no matter how strange everything had been, we couldn't ignore one simple fact. The house hadn't hurt us. Not yet. Our argument was interrupted by a sound. A low, distorted creak, like a door opening through static, came from the living room, faint and unnatural. We froze, exchanging a nervous glance. Slowly, we crept toward the sound. And there it was again, the pale blue door. This time, it stood behind the television, its wood just as weathered and cracked as before, the peeling paint catching faint glints of light in the dim room. I wish I could say I was scared, but I wasn't. At that moment, my curiosity overpowered everything else. Without a word, I slid the TV aside, grabbed the handle, and pulled the door open once more. It revealed a dark observatory, unlike anything I'd ever seen. The air was sharp and cold, sending chills down my spine. At the room's center stood a massive antique telescope, surrounded by desks piled high with star charts and crumpled notes. Above us, glowing planets hung suspended from the ceiling, their surfaces shimmering faintly under the moonlight that streamed through the glass dome above. "Wow," Maggie murmured, her voice filled with wonder. We wandered through the room in silence, our fear temporarily forgotten as we took in the strange beauty of it all. The telescope, though ancient, seemed fully functional. Couldn't resist. I leaned in and peered through the lens, expecting to see the familiar constellations of our night sky. But the stars I saw weren't ours. The sky through the telescope was like nothing I'd ever imagined. It wasn't just foreign, it felt wrong, like a cosmic nightmare. A black star loomed in the distance, faintly pulsing as if it were alive, its surface swallowing light like a bottomless void. Near it, a shattered planet hung in space, its molten core exposed and glowing with an eerie red heat, the broken fragments of its crust floating ominously nearby. And then there was another planet, teeming with movement. Not life as we knew it, but a chaos of writhing, alien appendages, shifting with unsettling purpose. "Maggie," I whispered, stepping back from the telescope. This isn't our sky." She leaned in to take a look, and I saw her expression harden as she peered through the lens. Her breath hitched. Whatever this telescope was meant to show, it revealed sights that defied explanation, things we were never supposed to see. The longer I looked, the more my stomach churned, as if the universe itself was mocking me, showing me my insignificance. I couldn't stop sketching them, those stars, those planets, those impossible landscapes. I charted them obsessively, hoping that mapping this alien sky might somehow help me make sense of it all. But it never did. One night, as we lay in bed, I heard it again. The faint, distorted creak of the pale blue door. This time, the sound came from the bathroom. My pulse quickened. I shook Maggie awake, and we crept toward the noise together. The door had moved again. It was embedded in the shower wall now, its wood as faded and worn as ever, its presence just as unnerving. My hand hesitated on the handle, but curiosity won out. I pulled it open. What lay beyond was a hallway of mirrors. Dim, ambient light surrounded us, emanating from nowhere in particular but illuminating the space just enough to see. Large mirrors lined the walls on either side, their surfaces pristine at first glance. Beneath our feet, the floor reflected the light like polished obsidian, cold and unyielding. A narrow path stretched ahead into the unknown, and without a word, we began to walk. At first, the mirrors showed only our reflections, me and Maggie, side by side. But soon, the reflections began to shift. Some mirrors stretched our images tall and thin, others bent them at odd angles, distorting us into grotesque shapes. One showed my reflection lagging a half-second behind my movements, as though it were struggling to keep up. Another showed me smiling faintly, but I wasn't smiling. "Maggie," I said, my voice shaky. My eyes darted to her reflection, but something was wrong. She wasn't beside me in the glass. I spun around in a panic, relieved to find her still next to me. But she was frozen, staring at a mirror with wide, unblinking eyes. "Luke," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're not in this one." I stepped closer to her, my heart pounding. The mirror she was looking at reflected only her, standing alone in the hallway, as if I'd vanished entirely. The deeper we ventured, the more surreal it became. The mirrors stopped showing us as we were and instead reflected impossible things. Hallways that twisted and branched where none existed, or scenes from our pasts. One mirror showed me as a child, standing alone in a dimly lit room I didn't recognize. Another displayed Maggie as a teenager, sitting on her bed with tears streaming down her face, clutching a letter. At the end of the hallway, a cracked mirror caught my eye. Its jagged surface reflected something dark and menacing, a shadowy presence crowding the glass. As I approached, I heard it, a muffled voice. My voice. "You've got to help us," it sobbed. My reflection in the mirror pressed its face against the glass, its features contorted in anguish. "Please, don't leave us here." "Maggie, are you seeing this?" I called, my voice cracking. She didn't answer. I turned to her and saw her transfixed by a mirror where her reflection was crouched in the fetal position. "We're trapped in here," her reflection whispered, its voice trembling. "It won't let us out." The air grew heavy, suffocating. The mirrors around us began to shift again, but now they didn't show us at all. They were filled with other faces, twisted, anguished, crying out in muffled sobs. Then the sobbing turned to laughter, hollow and chilling, echoing endlessly through the hall. And then silence. The lights began to go out. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Maggie's hand. We bolted toward the door, the darkness swallowing the hallway behind us. The sound of shattering glass filled the air, though none of the mirrors seemed to break. My lungs burned as we stumbled through the pale blue door and slammed it shut behind us. We collapsed onto the bathroom floor, gasping for air. "What the fuck is with this house?" I said, my voice raw with fear. "I don't know," Maggie replied, trembling. "But I'm starting to hate it. That was too much." The pale blue door stayed in the bathroom after that, unmoving for weeks. We avoided it completely, using the guest bathroom instead. It became a symbol of everything that was wrong, a thing neither of us dared confront. The house had shifted. From a curiosity we couldn't resist to a trap we couldn't escape. We talked about selling it, about running far away, but every time we hesitated. It wasn't just fear. The house had gotten under our skin, like it wanted us to stay, and some part of us wanted to listen. One afternoon, while I was hanging up clothes in the bedroom closet, I froze mid-reach. There it was again, the pale blue door. It stood exactly where we'd first seen it, as if it had never left. My heart thudded in my chest as I called out, "Lila!" She came running, her expression shifting to match mine. Part fear, part frustration, and, deep down, that nagging curiosity we couldn't seem to shake. "What do you think it's leading to this time?" I asked, my voice tight. "Are you serious, Dean?" She shot back, folding her arms. "Could be anything. A haunted garden? Another weird room? Maybe a theater playing twisted versions of our favorite movies. Who even knows anymore?" I swallowed hard. "Should we open it?" Her jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought she'd tell me to leave it alone. But then I saw it in her eyes, the same thing that burned in me. No matter how much we wanted to, we couldn't walk away. "Maybe just a quick look," she said softly. I nodded and gripped the handle. The door swung open without a sound, revealing something altogether strange and eerily familiar. The space beyond resembled the very first room we'd found, but it was different now, endlessly vast, like the walls and ceiling had been erased. There was only the floor, gleaming like dark, reflective glass, stretching out forever. A single light bulb lay on the ground, its weak, flickering glow casting long, lonely shadows. I hesitated, then stepped inside. My shoe met the surface with a soft, wet sound. Splish, slosh, plop. The noise startled me. It was like stepping into a shallow puddle, but when I looked, my shoes were completely dry. Lila followed, and together, we ventured deeper into the void. Each step sent ripples across the glassy floor, distorting the reflections of our hesitant forms. We walked in silence, the dim light behind us growing fainter with every step. Time seemed to stretch and lose meaning as the emptiness pressed in. My chest felt tight, like the air itself was heavier here. Finally, Lila broke the silence. "We should come back tomorrow," she whispered, her voice trembling. "With more supplies. I don't think we can figure this out in one trip." I nodded, relieved by the excuse to turn back. Curiosity gnawed at me, but I wasn't ready to face whatever might lie ahead. Not yet. The next day, we prepared as best we could. Lila tied a sturdy rope around a metal anchor in the closet, securing the other end around my waist. We brought a flashlight, a notepad, and a strange, nervous determination. With everything set, we stepped back into the abyss, the pale blue door closing softly behind us. The flashlight's beam barely pierced the void, but it provided enough comfort to keep us moving. We held hands as we walked, the rope trailing behind us like a lifeline. Every few minutes, I glanced back to make sure the light from the door was still visible. A tiny, flickering dot far behind us. Splish, slosh, plop. The sound of our footsteps echoed endlessly in the vast emptiness. The longer we walked, the more surreal it all felt, like we were marching through some kind of dream. "How big do you think this place is?" Lila asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of our steps. I shook my head, my throat too dry to answer right away. Before I could respond, something made me stop dead in my tracks. I turned back toward the door, and my heart sank. My chest tightened as my heart seemed to stop. The faint light spilling from the doorway flickered, then dimmed, shrinking until it disappeared entirely. The door slammed shut behind us with a sound like a gunshot, the echo reverberating through the emptiness. The sudden silence made my ears ring, and I stood frozen, fear paralyzing every muscle in my body. Then, with a sharp crack, the bulb shattered. Tiny shards of glass sprayed across the smooth floor, scattering into the void. Darkness enveloped us, thick and absolute. I fumbled for the flashlight, but when I clicked it on, it flickered weakly once, then died, leaving only the sound of our ragged breathing in the oppressive black. And then, behind us, something stirred. At first, it was subtle, a faint, wet squelch, as though something heavy and slimy was dragging itself through a pool of viscous mud. The noise grew louder, closer. A deep splash followed, echoing like a stone dropped into an endless well. Squelch. Slosh. Plop. "Lila, run!" I shouted, grabbing her hand. The air behind us thickened, growing unbearably hot. Whatever was back there, it was coming fast. The vibrations beneath our feet grew stronger with each step, and the sound of splashing became frantic, violent. My mind screamed to keep going, to keep running, but terror clamped down on any thought beyond escape. "Faster, Lila! Don't stop!" I yelled, my voice raw and cracking. The rope around my waist suddenly snapped, and my stomach dropped as we stumbled forward into the unknown, directionless and blind. For a terrifying moment, I thought we were lost. Then, out of the void, our hands slammed into the solid wood of the door. "Push!" I shouted, throwing my shoulder against it. The door creaked open just enough for us to tumble through, but as I turned to slam it shut, I felt resistance. Something on the other side was pushing back. The air around us turned scalding, a wave of heat so intense it made my eyes water. Then it came. A clawed hand, sharp and grotesque, shooting through the crack in the door and tearing into my shoulder. Pain exploded down my arm, and I screamed, blood soaking my shirt as I fought to shove the door closed. "Go back to hell!" Lila roared, throwing herself against the door. The thing clawed at me again, deeper this time, and I screamed through gritted teeth, desperation taking over. Its guttural, inhuman wails filled the air, echoing in my skull. The door shook violently, each impact a horrifying tug-of-war between us and whatever nightmare lurked on the other side. Then, all at once, the resistance vanished. The door slammed shut with a deafening boom. Lila and I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. My shoulder throbbed, blood dripping steadily onto the hardwood. The silence was deafening for a moment, until the first bang sounded against the door. The walls trembled with each impact. "Lila, we've got to go," I said through gritted teeth, clutching my injured shoulder. She nodded, helping me to my feet. We stumbled out of the house and into the night, leaving the pale blue door and its horrors behind. That was the last night we ever spent there. We tried to explain it to the police, calling it a break-in, but when they searched the house, the door was gone. No evidence, no scratches, no blood. Nothing. Frustrated and terrified, we didn't go back. Instead, we spent nights crashing with the Whitmans in cheap motels, even sleeping in the car. More than once, I thought about burning the place to the ground, but something stopped me every time. The door, though, it wasn't done with us. It became more persistent, appearing in new places with growing urgency. One night, it was under our bed. Another, it appeared on the ceiling, its pale wood stark against the plaster. Sometimes, it lurked behind mirrors, knocking faintly, then growing louder and more desperate. The banging became unbearable, a relentless reminder that it was always watching. We couldn't take it anymore. We put the house up for sale, telling the realtor we were relocating, that it was too much space for us. When an offer came, a young couple with a little girl, I didn't hesitate to accept. Packing up, I expected the door to put up one last fight, but it didn't. It appeared less and less as we loaded the truck, as if it knew its time with us was over. But as we drove away, I felt it. I swear I did. The house was watching us leave. That was years ago. Lila doesn't talk about it anymore. She's moved on, or at least she pretends to. Me? I can't forget. I still think about the door, about what we left behind. A few months ago, I looked up the house on Google Earth. It's still there, standing like nothing ever happened. In the street view, a family is unloading boxes. The parents are smiling, and their kids are playing in the yard. If you ever come across a door that feels out of place, that doesn't belong, don't open it. Some doors are not meant to be opened.